I was born in a small town in Wisconsin, the only child to two loving parents who poured their entire world into me. Ours was a quiet, simple life, homemade meals, long walks in the countryside, and snowed-in winters where we'd huddle by the fireplace sharing stories and laughter. My parents weren't rich, but they were wise, kind, and fiercely protective. I never knew what loneliness was as a child, because their love filled every corner of my world. Being the only daughter meant I was both the joy and the responsibility of the household. They taught me to value hard work, honesty, and above all the family. My father, a quiet man of few words, often said, "Amanda, you don't need a crowd. You just need people who show up when it matters." I never forgot that. Little did I know then, the people I would one day trust the most would be the ones to betray me in the deepest way possible. This is my story. The story of how I gave everything, my love, my trust, my inheritance, to a man who didn't deserve it. And how I found the strength to take it all back. It was the summer of my 26th year when I met him, Daniel, the man from Colorado who would change the course of my life in ways I never could have imagined. I had just started a sabbatical from teaching, hoping to explore more of the country and maybe, for once, live a little outside the structured routine I'd grown so used to. I decided to spend a few weeks volunteering at a community arts program in Denver. That's where our paths crossed. Daniel was charming in that easy, effortless way that made everyone around him smile. He had this rugged mountain man look, broad shoulders, sun-kissed skin, and a laugh that came from deep in his chest. He wasn't just handsome, he was attentive, always asking questions, always remembering the small details I shared. We talked about books, music, and childhood memories. He seemed fascinated by my life back in Wisconsin, and he often said he admired the strong bond one had with my parents. Even though they were gone, I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't in years. Losing both of my parents had left a hole in my heart, and somehow, Daniel's presence made it feel a little less empty. He would say things like, "You deserve someone who sees how special you are," and at the time, I believed he meant it. He told me he worked part-time in construction, that he was saving to buy a piece of land someday. He said his dream was to live off the grid, build a cabin, and live a quiet life away from the chaos of the city. That dream, oddly enough, mirrored something I'd always thought about too. A peaceful, grounded life, far from noise and pressure, where love was enough. We spent nearly every day together that summer. From long hikes through the Rockies to lazy afternoons in coffee shops, everything felt right. I wasn't naive, but I was in love, deeply, truly in love with a man who made me feel seen and cherished. By the end of my trip, Daniel and I had grown inseparable. He didn't ask me to stay, but his eyes did. I returned to Wisconsin, and we kept in touch daily, texts, calls, long late-night conversations about our future. It wasn't long before he brought up the idea of us building something together, not just a relationship, but a life, a home. He said he didn't feel comfortable living in a house I inherited. It would feel like he was just tagging along in my life. "A man needs to build something of his own," he said. "I want us to have a place that's ours from the ground up." I was touched by his pride, by the sincerity in his voice. At the time, I thought it came from a good place. I didn't see it as manipulation, I saw it as ambition. And so, with my heart full of hope and trust, I stepped into a future that would eventually teach me the difference between love and illusion. When Daniel first visited Wisconsin to see where I lived, he was quiet during the drive from the airport. I took him through the winding roads of my hometown, showing him the places I grew up in, the park where I learned to ride a bike, the lake where we used to fish, and finally, the house I had inherited from my parents. It wasn't just a house, it was a piece of my heart. A two-story home with a wide porch, surrounded by trees and memories. He looked around and nodded, saying, "It's beautiful," but something in his voice was distant. That night over dinner, I asked him what he really thought, about the idea of living there. I expected him to be relieved, maybe even excited. Instead, he hesitated. "Amanda," he said, choosing his words carefully, "I appreciate everything you've offered, but I can't live in a house that belongs to your parents. That's not how I was raised." I was taken aback. "What do you mean?" It's a man's place to provide a home for his woman, he said plainly. If I move in here, what does that make me? A kept man? I don't want people thinking I'm just living off your family's wealth. I blinked, trying to understand if he was being serious. In my world, love didn't come with titles or appearances. My parents had taught me that relationships were built on support, not roles. But Daniel saw it differently. He talked about how growing up in Colorado, the men in his neighborhood prided themselves on being providers, even if it meant struggling. He believed a man's worth was tied to what he could give, not what he received. It's not about the house, he said. It's about respect. At first, I admired his conviction. It felt noble in a way, old-fashioned, yes, but rooted in dignity. I tried to see it from his perspective, imagining how hard it must be for a man raised with so little to accept something so big from someone else. Still, I couldn't help but feel a sting. I had offered him a part of my life, my history, and he had turned it down, not with anger, but with something more painful, quiet pride. He stayed in a rented room while we continued our relationship long distance. He shared the space with 2 other men, saving every dollar, he claimed, for the day he could give me a real home. I started to believe in that dream. I told myself this was a sign of commitment, a promise that he wasn't with me for the wrong reasons. What I didn't realize then was that his pride would become a wedge, subtle at first, but slowly prying apart the foundation of trust we were building. In trying so hard to be the man he thought he needed to be, Daniel had already begun writing the rules of our relationship. And without noticing, I had started playing by them. It wasn't long after Daniel's first visit to Wisconsin that I made a trip back to Colorado to see him. He'd told me he was sharing a space with a couple of friends while saving up for our future, and I didn't think much of it. I imagined a small but cozy apartment, something temporary, practical. But when I arrived, the reality was far different. Daniel picked me up in his beat-up truck, and after a warm hug and a quick kiss, we drove about 30 minutes outside Denver to a rundown 2-story house that looked more like a halfway home than a bachelor pad. Inside, the living room was cluttered with old furniture and pizza boxes. There were clothes draped over the backs of chairs, the faint smell of sweat and cheap cologne lingering in the air. He led me to the back of the house where he shared a cramped bedroom with 2 other men, both strangers to me, who barely acknowledged my presence. His belongings were shoved into a corner, a single duffel bag, some tools, and a stack of books I had recommended. His mattress was on the floor, barely large enough for 1 person, let alone 2. I stood in the doorway, stunned. This wasn't what I had expected. It wasn't about the space or the mess, it was the realization that I didn't know Daniel as well as I thought I did. Still, I smiled and said, "It's just temporary, right?" He nodded. "Of course. Just until I save enough. I don't want to waste money on rent. I want to build something better for us." And just like that, I brushed aside my unease. I told myself it was admirable, smart, even, that he was sacrificing comfort now for our future. But deep down, a small voice whispered, "Why didn't he tell you the full truth from the start?" There were other red flags too, things I excused in the name of love. Like how he never let me see his pay stubs or talk about how much he actually made. Or how he'd occasionally make little comments when we went out to eat, like, "Must be nice to not have to count pennies," said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. One night, while lying on his mattress, I asked him why he didn't want to move back with me for a while until we could find land. His expression hardened. "Because I'm not a charity case, Amanda," he said. "I want to be the man you can depend on, not someone depending on you." I fell silent. I didn't want to push him, to make him feel small. I wanted to be supportive. After all, he wasn't lazy, he worked hard, and he had dreams. But that night, staring at the ceiling of that cramped room, a part of me wondered if love was supposed to feel this confusing, this uncertain, but I was already in too deep. I had chosen to believe in Daniel. And belief, I would soon learn, can blind you to the truth, even when it's staring you right in the face. A few weeks after I returned to Wisconsin from Colorado, Daniel called me late one evening. His voice was steady, focused, almost excited. Amanda, he said, I've been thinking. About us. About the future. I sat up in bed, already sensing something big was coming. He told me he had found a piece of land in a quiet, rural part of Colorado. Not too far from town, but far enough to feel like an escape from the noise. It's perfect, he said. Enough space for a house, a garden, even room for a few animals if we ever wanted. I smiled. It sounded lovely. Peaceful. But how would we afford it? I asked. He paused, then replied, I've done the math. If we act fast, we could get it for a good price. And if you're willing to sell one of your inherited properties, just one, we'd have enough for the land and to start building. The idea caught me off guard. Sell one of the homes my parents left me? It felt like giving away a piece of them. But Daniel was quick to reassure me. Amanda, this isn't about me. It's about us. A fresh start. A home that we create together. No ghosts, no memories, just you and me building something from the ground up. He had a way of saying things that made them sound noble. He wasn't asking for a handout, he was offering a shared dream. And as he spoke, painting a picture of a future filled with sunrises on the porch, quiet nights by a fireplace, and the two of us raising a family far from the chaos of the city, I began to believe in it, too. Still, I hesitated. I asked if we could co-own the property, put both our names on the deed. Of course, he said, but quickly followed it with, but it might complicate the paperwork since I'm the one here dealing with the local agents. We'll fix it later, once everything's set. That small voice inside me, cautious and clear, whispered again, be careful. But love is louder, and when you want to believe in someone, you find ways to silence your doubts. Within the month, I made the arrangements to sell one of the smaller homes my parents had left me. It wasn't the biggest or most valuable, but it had still been mine, filled with years of memories. I cried the day I signed the papers, but Daniel held me through it and told me I was doing the right thing. This sacrifice will mean everything for our future, he said. Looking back, that was the first major step I took away from the foundation my parents had built for me, and toward a future that seemed full of love. But was already shadowed by control. At the time, though, all I saw was a man with a plan, a dream we could share, and a future I was eager to build, no matter what it cost. The day we broke ground on our land felt like the beginning of a beautiful new chapter. The plot Daniel had found was nestled at the edge of a quiet forest, with sweeping views of the mountains and endless skies. It was untouched, wild, and full of promise. I remember standing there with Daniel, both of us in dusty boots and worn jeans, looking out over the empty space that would soon become our home. We held hands, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like everything was falling into place. Daniel was energized in a way I hadn't seen before. He was up at dawn, talking to contractors, hauling supplies, sketching out floor plans, and walking the land as if he'd owned it his entire life. We'll have the kitchen facing the east, he'd say, so we can wake up with the sun. Or, let's add a deck here so we can sit and watch the stars at night. His excitement was infectious. I found myself dreaming with him, imagining birthday parties on the lawn, quiet winters curled up by the fireplace, our future children playing in the woods. Every decision felt like a joint venture. I helped with the design choices, picking out paint colors, tiles, and windows that would let in just the right amount of light. Daniel always nodded in agreement, saying, whatever you love, I'll love too. At the time, it felt like teamwork, partnership, what love should be. To help stretch our budget, I dipped into my savings and sold a few family antiques. I didn't mind. This was our home, after all. A dream I was proud to invest in, but there were small things, barely noticeable at first, that hinted at a different truth. Daniel always dealt with the legal paperwork and the builders. When I offered to help, he brushed it off with a smile. It's all under control, he'd say. Besides, you've already done enough. You're making this dream happen. And when it came time to finalize the property documents, I asked again about putting both our names on the deed. He gave me the same gentle answer, don't worry, babe. I'll fix it once all the approvals are through. It's just easier for now with one name. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. As the house took shape, so did our life. We moved into the nearly finished home before it was fully complete. It still smelled of fresh paint and sawdust, but to me, it smelled like a fresh start. We had a bed, a working kitchen, and a dream realized. We cooked our first dinner together in that kitchen, laughing as we burned the garlic bread and spilled wine on the floor. I remember looking around that night and thinking, this is it. This is the life I was meant to live, but behind every beautiful dream, there can be a hidden cost. And while we built walls and painted rooms, I didn't yet realize I was also building something else. A future rooted in imbalance, where love would become leverage, and trust would be quietly rewritten. It was a warm afternoon when Daniel came home with a manila envelope and a proud smile on his face. "It's official," he said, waving the paperwork in the air. "The land and house are now registered." I smiled back at him, trying to match his excitement. We were sitting at the dining table, a table I had chosen, in a home I had financed. I reached for the papers eagerly, wanting to see our names side by side. But as I skimmed the first page, my stomach dropped. Only one name was listed on the deed, Daniel Carter. I read it again, slowly, trying to convince myself I was missing something. "Where's my name?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. He chuckled, brushing it off. "Relax, Amanda. This is just temporary." It was easier to process everything under one name, especially with local tax codes and building regulations. You know how slow bureaucracy is. "I'll add your name once we settle in fully." I nodded, but something about the explanation didn't sit right. I had heard this reasoning before. When we bought the land, when he applied for permits, even when he hired the builders, just easier this way, "We'll fix it later, don't worry." But now everything was done. The house was standing, the land cleared, and the title had been finalized. If there was ever a time to make it right, it was now. I stared at the paper in silence, trying not to let my discomfort show. I didn't want to seem ungrateful or accusatory. I told myself, "You trust him. He loves you. This is just another step in the process." But in truth, I felt like a ghost in my own home, present, contributing, but invisible on paper. That night, I lay awake next to him, replaying every conversation we'd had about ownership. I remembered how many times I'd asked about sharing the title, and how easily he had brushed me aside. A thought crept in, slow and unsettling. If something were to happen? If he changed his mind? Where would that leave me? I had poured nearly everything into this dream, my money, my time, my trust. And yet, legally, I had no claim to any of it. The house I had helped build, the land I had sacrificed for, all belonged to him. Still, I didn't argue. I didn't push. I wanted peace. I wanted to believe that love meant security, and that marriage, even without paperwork, was enough. After all, we shared a bed, a home, and dreams for the future. What more proof of commitment did I need? But deep down, something fragile inside me began to crack. Not loudly, not in an obvious way. Just a hairline fracture in the foundation of everything I thought we were building together. And like any fracture left unaddressed, it would only grow with time, until the whole house we built together began to collapse around me. At first, the changes were so subtle, I almost didn't notice them. Daniel still wore that easy smile, still made coffee in the mornings, still kissed my forehead before heading out to meet the builders or run errands. But beneath the surface, something had shifted, and it started with money. It began with small comments. If I bought groceries or ordered something online, he'd casually ask, "Was that really necessary?" If I treated myself to a haircut or a new pair of shoes, he'd raise an eyebrow and say, "You're not trying to impress anyone, are you?" They sounded like jokes, but there was a sharpness in his voice that hadn't been there before. Then came the questions about my bank account. "How much do you have saved again?" he asked one evening while we were balancing household expenses. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. I had always been responsible with money, careful, cautious. My parents taught me to save for a rainy day, and I still followed their example. Just curious, he said with a shrug. It's good to know what we're working with. He didn't have a bank account of his own. Everything went through mine. I paid the bills, bought the groceries, and covered any construction overages. Daniel insisted it was just until the house was finished and he could get back on his feet. I agreed, because that's what love does, it gives, even when it's uncomfortable. But soon, I wasn't just paying, I was asking. Asking if it was okay to spend money. Asking if we could hold off on certain purchases. And slowly, without meaning to, I stopped making decisions altogether. Daniel took over everything: who we hired to finish the house, what furniture we bought, even where we placed the bedroom windows. If I voiced a preference, he'd smile and say, "That's cute, but trust me, this will be better." Always with that charming tone, like he knew best and I was just sweet for having an opinion. He began tracking my routines. If I left the house, he'd ask where I was going, how long I'd be, and why I didn't invite him. At first, it seemed like affection, concern. But soon, it felt more like surveillance. Once, I scheduled a lunch with an old colleague who was passing through town. When I mentioned it to Daniel, he frowned. "Why didn't you tell me earlier? Are you trying to keep something from me?" The accusation took me by surprise. I canceled the lunch. I told myself he was stressed, that building a home and starting a life together came with pressure. I reasoned that he just wanted to feel in control of something, given his modest upbringing and the financial imbalance between us. But late at night, I found myself missing something I hadn't noticed was gone: my voice. My independence. The woman who used to make confident choices without fear of upsetting someone she loved, and though I didn't want to admit it yet, I could feel it. Daniel was no longer just my partner. He was becoming the one holding the reins, and I was quietly being steered. By the time the house was finished and we had officially settled in, Daniel's questions about money had become routine, almost expected. "Are you sure that's all you have?" he would ask, scanning our expenses like an auditor. "Didn't your parents leave you more than just that one house?" He asked casually, like he was making conversation, but there was always a pointedness in his tone. I'd long since stopped feeling comfortable discussing my finances. But Daniel kept pushing, always with that same mix of charm and pressure. If we had a bit more, we could upgrade the kitchen. Or maybe invest in a small business together, he'd suggest. Wouldn't it be great if our money could work for us? At first, I resisted. I had sold one home already to help us build this new life, and that alone had been difficult. The others, 2 rental properties and a lakefront cabin my father had built with his own hands, felt sacred. They weren't just real estate. They were legacy. Memories. Pieces of my parents that still felt alive in brick, wood, and space. So I told him there were no other properties. That the house I sold was it. It was a like small, but purposeful. I needed to protect what little I had left, but Daniel didn't let up. Every time a financial issue came up, a car repair, a construction delay, a medical bill, he circled back to the same question. "Are you sure you're telling me everything?" His tone grew more impatient with each conversation. And with every new pressure point, guilt began to creep in. Maybe I was being unfair. Maybe I was holding us back. The turning point came when the plumbing in our newly built home failed after a harsh winter storm. The repair costs were higher than we anticipated, and Daniel was furious. "If we'd just had a little more cushion," he said, slamming the estimate down on the table, "we wouldn't be stuck like this." I hated the feeling of tension between us. I hated the way he looked at me, as if I were the one creating all the obstacles. And so, I caved. I sold the smaller of the 2 rental homes, quietly, without much ceremony. When the sale closed, I told Daniel a distant relative had left me some unexpected funds. His eyes lit up, and his mood improved instantly, and just like that, I learned something I didn't want to know. Peace, in this new life, had a price tag. Over the following year, under his subtle yet constant pressure, I sold the second rental too. Then came the hardest of them all, the lake cabin. I cried when I signed the final papers, the ink smudging slightly from my tears. I told Daniel the money was gone after that. And this time, it was mostly true, but in the process, something inside me broke. Not because of what I had given up, but because I had given in. I was no longer just keeping secrets to protect my inheritance. I was hiding truths to survive a relationship I no longer fully recognized. At some point, without me realizing exactly when, the warmth between us began to cool. Daniel still said all the right things. I love you, we're in this together, you're the best thing that ever happened to me, but there was a hollowness to his words, as if they were part of a script he no longer believed in. His touch felt different too. Less affectionate. Less tender. Sometimes, it felt like he was patting the back of a business partner rather than holding a woman he loved. I started noticing how his moods changed depending on what I could give. If I offered help, financial or otherwise, he was cheerful, affectionate, attentive. But if I hesitated, if I asked questions or said we needed to wait, he'd withdraw into silence or flash me that irritated smile that said more than words ever could. It was becoming harder to ignore. The man who once looked at me like I was his world now looked through me like I was just another obligation. Our conversations shifted from dreams and laughter to bills, stress, and vague promises of better days ahead. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, I found myself standing at the kitchen sink staring out the window, replaying the last year in my mind. We had built this house, yes, but at what cost? I had sold nearly everything my parents left me. I had given up pieces of myself, my independence, and my peace of mind, all for a future that felt increasingly out of reach. I turned to look at Daniel sitting on the couch, scrolling his phone, barely acknowledging my presence. And for the first time, I asked myself the question I had been too afraid to face: was this really love? Or was it leverage? Had Daniel ever loved me for who I was, or for what I had? I had been so quick to romanticize his pride, to see his ambition as passion. But now, I wasn't sure. Everything he had wanted, he had taken. The house, the land, the money. And each time I gave something, he loved me just a little more, until there was nothing left to give. I thought about the early days, the hikes in Colorado, the long conversations, the soft-spoken promises, and I wondered how much of it was genuine. Had he seen me as a partner? Or had he seen me as a solution? When I tried to bring it up, tried to express how I felt used, he brushed it off with a grin. "You're overthinking again," he said. "You always do this when things get real." That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by a truth I didn't want to admit. I had loved him with everything I had. But he loved what I could do for him, and now that the giving was done, so, it seemed, was his affection. In the middle of all the confusion and quiet heartbreak, life gave me a reason to smile again: a son. I found out I was pregnant on a cold autumn morning, the kind where the sky hangs low and the air smells like rain. I remember sitting alone in the bathroom, staring at the test, waiting for the lines to appear. When they did, I felt an overwhelming rush of emotion: shock, joy, fear, and above all, hope. I told Daniel that evening, expecting a mix of surprise and happiness. He blinked a few times, silent for a moment longer than I expected. Then he pulled me into a hug and said, "Well, I guess we better get serious now, huh?" It wasn't the dreamy, emotional reaction I had imagined. But I clung to the embrace. Maybe this was our fresh start. Maybe this child would bring us closer again. Pregnancy was hard, though not in the ways I thought it would be. Physically, I was fine, healthy, careful, determined. But emotionally, I carried the weight of two people. Daniel grew more distant with every passing month. He still came to the doctor's appointments when I asked, but he never volunteered. He rarely touched my belly, never spoke to the baby, and avoided conversations about parenting. "I'm just not good with this stuff," he'd say. "I'll be more involved when he's here." Still, I didn't let it dim my excitement. I spent hours setting up the nursery alone, painting the walls a calming shade of green, placing hand-me-down books from my childhood on the shelf. Every time I felt a kick, I whispered, "You're not alone. I'm here." I'll always be here. When our son was born, a perfect, red-faced, wide-eyed little boy, we named him Caleb. Holding him for the first time, I cried harder than I ever had. Not from pain, not even from joy, but from something deeper, purpose. In that tiny bundle, I found something Daniel could never take from me, unconditional love. For the first few days, Daniel was attentive. He held Caleb cautiously, took photos, even stayed up late once to rock him when I couldn't keep my eyes open. I allowed myself to believe, just for a moment, that this child would change everything. That maybe Daniel just needed time to step into fatherhood the way I had stepped into motherhood the moment I saw that second line. But it didn't last. Within weeks, the novelty wore off. Daniel was back to his old habits, distant, distracted, and controlling. He complained about the cost of diapers, the noise, the mess. He said things like, "You wanted this, remember?" As if Caleb were a chore rather than a miracle. Still, every time I looked into my son's eyes, I knew I had done something right. Amid the growing shadows of our relationship, Caleb was my light. He gave me strength. And though I didn't yet know how or when, I began to sense that one day, I would need that strength to walk away, for his sake, and for mine. It started subtly, almost invisibly, like a cold draft creeping under a door you thought was sealed. The warmth between Daniel and me, already thinning, began to freeze over completely after Caleb was born. The man who once whispered promises of forever now spoke with clipped tones and sharp words that carried hidden knives. The first time I truly noticed it, I had asked where he'd been. He'd come home well past midnight, smelling faintly of alcohol, his eyes glazed with something colder than exhaustion. "I was out," he said, tossing his keys on the table without looking at me. "Out where?" I asked gently, trying not to sound accusing. "You didn't answer my calls." That's when it came. A scoff. A hard stare. And then the words, "This is my house, Amanda. I don't have to check in with anyone." I stood there, stunned. My house. His house. Never mind the fact that I'd sold nearly everything I inherited to make it a reality. That I had chosen paint colors, shopped for fixtures, balanced every budget. None of that mattered now, not to him. From that day on, something in Daniel shifted. Or maybe it had always been there, just hidden beneath the surface. The man who once called me his partner now treated me like an inconvenience. He stopped asking for my opinion. Decisions about the house, our expenses, even parenting choices, were made without a word to me. When I spoke up, he'd roll his eyes or dismiss me outright. "Why are you so emotional all the time? You always overreact. You don't know what you're talking about." If I dared question a purchase or asked about the bills he claimed to be handling, he'd snap, "That's none of your business." None of my business. The phrase rang in my ears like a bell each time he said it. Louder and more cruel than before. I had gone from being the woman he claimed to love, to a silent figure in the background of his life. Even in front of Caleb, he began raising his voice. Not full shouting, but harsh enough to frighten me, and more than once, make our son cry. When I told him to lower his voice, he laughed and said, "He better get used to it. This world isn't soft, and I'm not raising a weak boy." I started walking on eggshells. I kept the house spotless, the meals ready, the baby fed, all to avoid the next outburst. I told myself it was temporary, that he was just overwhelmed. But the truth was becoming impossible to deny. The man I loved had become someone I didn't recognize. Someone who didn't value me. Someone who thought that ownership came not just with land and title, but with people, too. Every time he told me it was his house, or his life, or that I had no right to ask questions, I felt a little piece of myself slip away. And I began to wonder just how long I could keep pretending that this was still a home. And not a cage. It was just past midnight when I heard the front door creak open. Caleb had been restless all evening, and I had only just managed to get him back to sleep. I was still in my robe, sitting on the edge of the bed, waiting, hoping that Daniel would finally come home. He'd been gone since morning, no calls, no messages. But I was used to the silence by now. what I wasn't used to was the sound of two sets of footsteps coming down the hallway. I stood, heart pounding, and stepped out into the dim light of the living room. And there he was, Daniel, smirking, his arm draped casually around the shoulders of a young woman who couldn't have been older than 22. She was pretty, bright-eyed, dressed like she had come from a party. She looked confused but not uncomfortable, as if she had no idea what she was walking into. I blinked, speechless. Daniel. Who is this? He didn't flinch. Didn't look ashamed. In fact, he looked bored. Her name is Kiara, he said flatly, as if introducing me to a coworker. She's my fiancée. The word hit me like ice water. I laughed, thinking maybe he was drunk or playing some sick joke. You're what? My fiancée, he repeated. We're getting married next year. She'll be living here with me. I stared at him, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. What are you talking about? What about me? Caleb? His expression hardened. We're not married. Amanda. We never were. You knew that. No papers. No vows. You're just someone I used to live with. Just someone. Everything froze. The years we spent building this house, the money I poured into it, the child we created together, it was all dismissed with a shrug. I looked at Kiara, who was now visibly uncomfortable, slowly pulling away from his arm. You told me you were separated, she muttered. Daniel rolled his eyes. We are. This is just drama. I felt like the walls were closing in. My breath caught in my chest, not from anger, but from heartbreak so deep it made my knees weak. I glanced toward the hallway, where my son lay sleeping, oblivious to the chaos unraveling just a room away. You can't just bring someone into our home, I said, my voice shaking. Daniel crossed his arms and gave a cruel smile. It's my home. Remember? You signed nothing. Your name isn't on anything. You have no say. That night, I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I walked quietly back to my room, packed a small bag, scooped Caleb gently from his crib, and left. No goodbyes. No fights. Just the crushing silence of a betrayal so complete, it didn't need words. And as I drove through the night toward the only place I had left, my parents' old cabin in Alabama, I promised myself something. I would never, ever let that man hurt me or my son again. In the quiet days that followed my escape to Alabama, the reality of everything began to settle like thick dust on my chest. I had driven through the night with Caleb asleep in the back seat, tears streaming down my face, adrenaline keeping me awake. But once I reached the old family cabin, weathered but still standing, I finally exhaled. I was safe. My son was safe. But I was also completely, painfully alone. The first morning in the cabin, I sat at the kitchen table with a hot cup of tea, staring out the window. I hadn't slept more than an hour. My mind spinning with unanswered questions and cold realizations. One, in particular, kept echoing louder than the rest: we weren't married. Not legally. We had talked about marriage, yes. Early on, before the house, before Caleb, when everything still felt full of promise. He had said the paperwork didn't matter, that love was enough, that we were already one. And I, blinded by trust, believed him. I had assumed we'd formalize it eventually. But Daniel had always found a reason to delay. Too busy, not the right time. Let's finish the house first, let's wait until things settle down. Now I saw the truth: he never intended to marry me. Because marriage would have given me legal standing. Rights. Protection. A voice. I spent the next few days making calls, quietly, cautiously, reaching out to a family lawyer a friend had recommended. I needed to know what I had left. What I could fight for. The conversation was short and brutal: no marriage license, no joint property deeds, no co-owned accounts. The lawyer asked, her voice calm but firm. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Then legally, Amanda. You have no claim to the home or any assets he controls. Everything he owns is his alone. The words felt like punches. I had invested my inheritance, my savings, years of my life, only to be told I had no legal right to any of it. I was nothing more than a guest in the house I had helped build. A visitor in the life I thought we were creating together. I hung up and sat in silence for a long time, staring at the dusty beams above the kitchen. My mother's voice echoed in my head, "Always protect yourself, Amanda. Love with your whole heart, but never lose your mind." I had done the opposite. I had trusted blindly, given everything, and now I was starting from scratch. But even in that crushing moment of realization, something else stirred inside me, resolve. He may have taken my home, my money, and the illusion of a marriage, but he hadn't taken me. And more importantly, he hadn't taken Caleb. I wasn't legally married. I wasn't entitled to his home. But I still had one thing he could never erase, the truth, and now, it was time to rebuild, not for him, not for revenge, but for myself. And for my son, leaving that house wasn't just walking out a front door, it was walking away from years of dreams, sacrifices, and heartbreak. That night, after Daniel brought another woman into the home I had helped build, something inside me broke, but not in the way he expected. It wasn't weakness. It was clarity. I saw the truth with sharp edges. If I stayed, I would lose every last piece of myself. And worse, I'd raise my son in the shadow of a man who had no respect for the life we had built or the people in it, so I did what I never thought I'd do. I left. I packed as quietly as I could, just a few essentials, diapers, a change of clothes for Caleb, my documents, and some cash I had stashed away for emergencies. He was barely a year old, fast asleep, warm in his pajamas and unaware of the chaos swirling around him. I lifted him gently into his carrier, my heart aching as I looked around the home one last time, the nursery, the kitchen, the walls I had painted with hope. Everything felt like a lie now. But Caleb, he was the only truth left. And he was the reason I didn't collapse. Daniel didn't try to stop me. He was too caught up in his new performance, playing the loving fiancé to a girl who didn't yet know who he really was. Maybe he didn't believe I had it in me to walk away. Maybe he thought I had nowhere to go. But he didn't know about the cabin in Alabama, my parents' quiet haven tucked into the woods, left untouched since they passed. I drove through the night, tears falling freely down my face as the headlights lit up the dark highway. Caleb slept most of the way, his gentle breathing reminding me that I wasn't alone. I talked to him softly during the drive. Not because he could understand, but because I needed to hear my own voice. I told him everything would be okay. I told him he was loved. I promised him a better life, one without yelling, without fear, without betrayal. When we arrived at the cabin, the early morning light was just beginning to break through the trees. The place was dusty and worn, but it felt like sanctuary. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and breathed in the scent of wood and memory. I placed Caleb on the old couch wrapped in a blanket, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself cry freely, not from sadness, but from release. Leaving took everything I had. Courage, I didn't know I possessed. Strength, I hadn't felt in years. But I did it. For me. For Caleb. For the chance to rebuild something real, something honest. I may have walked out with almost nothing. But I carried the most important thing, my son, and in that, I realized, I hadn't lost everything. I had saved everything that mattered. The first few mornings in the cabin were quiet, almost too quiet. After years of tension, shouting, and walking on eggshells, the silence was unfamiliar but comforting. I would wake up to the sound of birdsong and rustling leaves outside the windows instead of Daniel's sharp words or the uneasy silence that came after another argument. The air was cool and clean, the light soft as it filtered through the trees. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe again. The cabin, though old and a little worn, was a blessing. My parents had used it as a retreat during summers, and after they passed, I couldn't bear to sell it. It wasn't much, just a small living room, a kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a creaky porch, but it held pieces of them everywhere. My mother's favorite tea mug still sat in the cupboard. And my father's old flannel jacket hung on a hook by the door. Being here reminded me of who I was before everything fell apart. Caleb adjusted quickly, far better than I expected. He didn't miss the big house or the expensive toys Daniel insisted on buying. He was content with the simple things, stacking wooden blocks, exploring the backyard, giggling at the squirrels on the porch. Watching him reminded me that happiness doesn't need grandeur, it needs peace, love, and safety. I, on the other hand, had to learn everything all over again. I was a single mother now, with no partner, no income, and barely a plan. But for once, I wasn't afraid. I took things one step at a time. I cleaned the cabin room by room, cleared out old boxes, and made a space for Caleb to sleep and play. I sold a few items I had brought with me for quick cash and began researching remote teaching jobs, anything I could do while caring for my son. Each small victory felt huge. Fixing the leaky sink on my own. Baking our first loaf of bread together. Laughing again, genuinely, without guilt. I began journaling at night, pouring out everything I had bottled up over the years. The pain. The regrets. The relief. Slowly, my heart began to soften. There were hard days, too. Days when I missed the life I thought I had, or when Caleb got sick and I wished I had someone to lean on. But even in those moments, I never once wished to go back. I had found something far more valuable than comfort. I had found freedom. Starting over wasn't just about survival. It was about reclaiming myself. About building a home not defined by walls or ownership, but by love and truth. And though I didn't know what the future held, I knew I was no longer living in someone else's shadow. I was finally standing in the light, just me, my son, and the quiet promise of a new beginning. It had been nearly 3 years since I left Daniel. 3 long, healing years spent raising Caleb, finding my footing, and rebuilding the woman I once was. Life in the cabin had settled into a peaceful rhythm. The mornings were filled with my son's laughter, and the evenings ended in quiet reflection, sometimes lonely, yes, but always free. I hadn't spoken to Daniel since that night I walked out, and I never intended to. That chapter was closed. Then, one afternoon, my phone rang. It was from a mutual acquaintance we hadn't spoken to in years, a woman named Lisa who had once worked with Daniel on one of his many failed business ventures. Her voice was cautious, like she wasn't sure how much I wanted to know. "Amanda," she said, "I thought you should hear it from someone before it reaches you some other way. Daniel. He's in New York. Homeless. And not doing well." I blinked, holding Caleb's hand as we walked through the grocery store. "Homeless?" I asked, not entirely understanding. Lisa sighed. "He started drinking heavily after you left. Sold the house, spent the money. Burned bridges with everyone. He's living on the streets now. I saw someone post a photo of him online. He's barely recognizable." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I stood there in the aisle between cereal boxes and baby formula, trying to wrap my mind around the image. The man who once strutted around declaring ownership of everything I built, now alone, broke, and broken. I thanked her and ended the call, my hands shaking slightly. Caleb tugged my sleeve, asking if we could get the cereal with the bears on it, and I nodded absently. That night, after putting him to bed, I sat on the porch and let the news wash over me. A part of me felt vindicated, like the universe had finally balanced the scale. The man who had used me, lied to me, and discarded me like I was nothing had lost everything. But another part of me felt hollow. Not sad, exactly, but not triumphant either, because despite everything, I had loved him once. I had shared my home, my heart, my child with him. And now he was sleeping on concrete somewhere, begging for change. I didn't want him back. I didn't even pity him. But I couldn't deny the strange ache that came with seeing someone you once knew so intimately fall so far. A week later, I received a message, an unfamiliar number with just a few words. "Amanda, it's me. I'm sorry. I need help. Please." I didn't reply. I read the message once, then deleted it. Not out of cruelty, but clarity. I had given him everything once, my trust, my inheritance, my love, and he had thrown it away. Now I had something far more precious, peace, and no matter how far he fell, I wasn't going to climb back into the fire I had finally escaped. The phone rang just after sunset. I had just put Caleb to bed, the dishes were drying in the rack, and I was finally settling into the quiet stillness of the evening. The number was unfamiliar, but something about it made my chest tighten. I hesitated before answering. Amanda? The voice cracked through the speaker, raspy, tired, almost unrecognizable. It was Daniel. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I just sat there, frozen, phone pressed to my ear, the sound of his voice opening a door I had sealed tightly shut. It's me, he said again. Please don't hang up. I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I needed to try. The silence stretched between us. I could feel my heart pounding, my emotions roaring beneath the surface, anger, pain, disbelief. His voice brought back too much. The betrayal, the lies, the night he walked in with another woman and shattered everything we had. I heard you're in New York, I said coldly, finally finding my voice. I am, he replied. I've lost everything, Amanda. The house. The money, my friends. I'm not proud of what I became. I was stupid. I was cruel. I need to say I'm sorry. A bitter laugh escaped me. Now you're sorry? After everything? I know it doesn't change what I did, he said quickly. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I think about you and Caleb every day. I miss him. I miss the life we had. Tears welled in my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. You didn't miss us when you brought another woman into our home. You didn't miss us when you sold the house I paid for, or when you erased me from everything. He was quiet. I don't need your apology, I continued, voice firm now. I needed it years ago, when it might have mattered. You made your choices. And so did I just wanted to hear your voice one more time, he said. I'm trying to get clean. I'm in a shelter. I don't expect anything from you, I regret it all. I closed my eyes, the ache of old wounds pulsing beneath my ribs. Part of me wanted to scream. Part of me wanted to hang up. But most of all, I wanted to end it. On my terms. I hope you get the help you need, I said softly. But I'm not your lifeline. I'm not your redemption. My son and we moved on. I didn't wait for a reply. I ended the call, slowly set the phone down, and let the silence fill the room. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't bitterness. It was closure. That final call reminded me that forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes, it's just letting go of the weight someone else left behind, and choosing never to carry it again. In the months after that final call, life found a quiet rhythm again, one grounded not in bitterness or regret, but in purpose. And that purpose was Caleb. Raising him became my center, my light, and my strength. There were mornings when I'd wake up to the sound of his laughter echoing through the cabin, chasing away the lingering ghosts of the past. His energy was endless, his curiosity boundless. Every day, he reminded me that there was still beauty in the world, still something worth pouring all my love into. I knew the home we had wasn't luxurious, but it was safe. And more importantly, it was honest. I made sure he grew up surrounded by love, patience, and stability, things I had sacrificed during my years with Daniel. The cabin, with its creaky floors and worn furniture, became a haven of warmth. Every corner held a memory we created together. Baking cookies in the small kitchen, building forts out of couch cushions, sitting on the porch and naming the shapes in the clouds. There were hard days too, days when money was tight, when Caleb asked why he didn't have a dad like other kids at school. I never badmouthed Daniel, but I never lied either. Some people aren't ready to be the kind of parent a child deserves, I told him gently. But you're surrounded by love, and that's what matters most. It became my mission not just to raise a good boy, but to raise a whole one. I wanted to break the cycle of silence, of manipulation, of enduring pain just to keep the peace. I taught Caleb about emotions, about respect, about boundaries. We talked openly, even when it was uncomfortable. I let him cry. I let him question. And when he succeeded, I celebrated him. When he stumbled, I stood by him, not with scolding, but with support. I went back to teaching part-time online and eventually started tutoring kids in town. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and allowed me to be present. Every dollar earned felt like a small rebellion against the life I had left behind, a declaration that I could stand on my own, and that I would build something better for my son. Caleb thrived in this new life. He was kind, bright, and full of empathy, so unlike the man whose blood he shared. He asked deep questions, helped neighbors without being asked, and once told me he wanted to grow up to build homes for people who need a fresh start. That one sentence brought tears to my eyes. In him, I saw the future I never had. A chance to do things differently. To give him tools I never received. To raise a boy who would become a man that would never make a woman feel small. My son didn't just give me a reason to live. He gave me a reason to heal, to rise, and to believe again. Caleb was, and always would be, my greatest strength. Sometimes, late at night, after Caleb has fallen asleep and the house is wrapped in silence, I sit on the porch and think about everything that's happened. The years I gave away, the love I thought I had, the life I thought I was building. The memories come in waves, soft and sharp all at once. But now, they don't control me. They don't haunt me. They simply remind me of how far I've come. There was a time when I would replay every moment with Daniel, trying to make sense of it all. Wondering what I missed, where I went wrong, or how someone I loved so deeply could be so calculating. But healing has a way of teaching you things you weren't ready to learn back then. I know now that loving someone isn't enough, not when that love costs you your voice, your peace, your dignity. I've made peace with the fact that there will never be justice for everything he took from me. No court will return the money, the years, or the trust he squandered. But I've gained something more valuable than retribution, freedom. The day I left, I walked away from more than a house. I walked away from emotional chains, from silence, from the slow erasure of who I was. And I never looked back, not even when he begged, not even when guilt tried to sink its claws into my heart. I knew if I turned around, even for a second, I might falter. So I didn't. The cabin, once a temporary shelter, became my sanctuary. And in that sanctuary, I found myself again. I rediscovered the woman I used to be, the one who loved books, who laughed loudly, who believed in kindness. And I became someone new too, stronger, wiser, and far less willing to tolerate half-hearted love or manipulative charm. I learned to forgive myself. That was the hardest part. Not for loving him, but for staying too long. For doubting my own instincts. For giving so much without protecting anything for myself. But motherhood changed me. Caleb gave me a reason to fight, and more than that, a reason to never repeat the past. Some people say time heals all wounds. I think that's only half true. Time and choice, the choice to move forward, to stop reopening old scars, to stop waiting for apologies that will never come. Healing is a daily decision. And every day I choose it, I feel lighter. Daniel is just a memory now, one that no longer holds power over me. He taught me what love is not, and for that, I'm strangely grateful. I don't need revenge. I don't need closure from him. I have everything I need right here, a quiet life, a bright sun, and the knowledge that I chose myself when it mattered most. And as I sit on this porch, wrapped in peace and promise, I know one truth for certain: I'll never look back.